Order. We have no questions. Secretary of State for the Home Department. We start with question 1, Felicity Buchan.
Number 1, please, Mr. Speaker.
Home Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, before I answer the question and come straight to it, can I just join you in paying tribute to PC Keith Palmer in the way in which you did earlier on? Keith was a brave, brave officer dedicated to his work, and we will always remember him. Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I would like to group this question with questions 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. Following last week's meeting of the Crime and Justice Task Force, chaired by the Prime Minister, the Government has doubled the size of the Safer Streets Fund, which will go towards neighbourhood measures designed to improve public safety and protection.
Priti Patel.
Knife and gang crime is sadly an issue in my constituency, but at the same time, 2 police stations in the north of my constituency are under threat. One at Notting Hill Police Station, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, is planning to sell. He closed its front counter a couple of years ago. And the other police station on Lancaster Road, the lease is due to expire. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that given this government's huge investment in the police, we need physical police stations in London and in the north of my constituency?
Well, my friend is absolutely right, and actually I'd like to pay tribute to her because she's an incredible constituency MP, and I've spent time with her myself on patrol, where she has joined me too, very much to back the police and support the police. I'm incredibly disappointed in what she has said about police stations closing in her constituency. It is a fact that they are a vital lifeline to protecting communities and the public. And of course, she will know that police and crime commissioners are elected to be accountable to the communities that they serve. And with that, they also need to be a strong voice when it comes to fighting crime and dealing with, as my honourable friend has rightly highlighted, the issue of knife crime, drug crime, and also attacks on young people.
Let's go to Ian Levy. Ian.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year, I oversaw the temporary creation of a mobile police station in Blythe Marketplace. This was very well received by the local residents and retailers in the town, as well as being supported by our local fantastic police force. However, a more permanent fixture, as well as the installation of CCTV, would be welcomed by all. Would my right honourable friend support me, the police and the residents of Blythe Valley in our endeavours to create a safer environment for all?
Well, my honourable friend, Mr. Speaker, is absolutely right. And can I commend him? I mean, he, again, is a tour de force locally, giving strong voice and representation to safer streets and safer community, and again, backing the police. And he is right to work with the police locally to make sure that more community support and safety measures come in place. I'll support him and work with him whatever way I can, and he will also know that when it comes to the funding for these schemes, the money is there from central government. Police and crime commissioners, Mr. Speaker, I'd urge all police and crime commissioners to step up to absolutely make sure that they tap into that funding to make sure these measures are coming in place.
Nikki.
Question number 3, Mr. Speaker.
No, it's straight in.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I also associate myself with the remembrance today of PC Palmer and the other victims we lost on that day. I remember coming out of Westminster Tube at exactly this time, that 4 years ago, and saw the aftermath of that dreadful terrorist attack. Mr. Speaker, I welcome the reopening of the Violence Against Women and Girls Call for Evidence, which I believe now closes this Friday, the 26th of March, and I would encourage as many people to have their say as possible. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that it is vital that we listen to victims of violence and all women and girls to really understand their experiences in their daily lives, so that we can ensure that the strategy that the government finally introduces does tackle violence, harassment and abuse of women and girls?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and I would like to echo her calls to continue the encouragement for people to respond to the survey. Mr. Speaker, we've already had in excess of 135,000 people write into the survey since it's been reopened. But there's a fundamental point here. By having people join that consultation, to join that public survey, we want their views, because their views matter, but also their personal experiences matter, and it's personal experiences and insights, whether or not you've been a victim, which is always a terrible, terrible thing, but also if you've interacted with this system, and it could be the criminal justice system, or it could be victim support services, or it could be the police, it could be any aspect of the system, that comes together so that we can have the right type of approach that gives voice and also gives strength to the type of policies and the legislation that we bring forward.
Let's go to Rob Butler. Rob.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the past year in Aylesbury Vale, robberies have fallen by 35%, and many more criminals have been brought to justice for violent offences. Will my right honourable friend join me in congratulating the superb officers at Thames Valley Police's Aylesbury Police Station for these achievements? And can she tell the House how her department will ensure that those officers can continue to keep my local community safe, especially for women?
Well, my honourable friend absolutely will know of and has heard me speak of great praise to Thames Valley Police for their incredible work, dedication, and there are many examples that we have spoken about in the past as well. But he has spoken about Thames Valley Aylesbury and their own work in reducing crime within our communities, and that is very much down to great leadership, no doubt about that. It's down to resourcing, the money that government is putting in place, the new police officers, the visibility, the money that goes into crime reduction, the surge funding that has gone in. So I absolutely stand with him and also with his local officers that are doing outstanding work.
James Sutton.
Mr. Speaker, many of my constituents in Bracknell have contacted me recently to express concern about antisocial behaviour. Yeah. This includes nuisance neighbours, drugs abuse, speeding cars and general disorder. Given that the government has a responsibility to safeguard the law-abiding majority, could my right honourable friend please confirm what's been done to curb it?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and knowing his constituency from previous visits as I do, and obviously knowing the way in which the police work locally, we absolutely stand with them in terms of our determination to stamp out criminality, but also antisocial behaviour, the things that blight communities. And with that, of course, we stand on the side of the silent law-abiding majority. No question about that whatsoever. And of course, the funding that we have seen, the more police officers that he has, and within his force and his constituency, along with the money for Safer Street funds, will absolutely go a long way to delivering for his constituents.
Let's go to Robert Largan. Robert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Recently, gangs of bicycle and car thieves have been targeting the High Peak, travelling into the area from both Greater Manchester and Yorkshire. Derbyshire Police are working hard to try and tackle this problem, but can I urge the Home Secretary to do more to ensure that different police forces, including British Transport Police, work more closely together to tackle criminal gangs that operate over county lines?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and he's right to highlight the blended way in which forces should come together, because county lines cross boundaries. So whether it's British Transport Police, his own police force, or neighbouring forces as well, absolutely pulling together to deal with the level of criminality that he has spoken about. And that is taking place on one of the biggest issues that faces our country, which is county line drug gangs. And he will know, we've spoken previously of the great operational work that's taking place across our police forces and across our intelligence agencies as well, to go after the criminals that are out there pursuing such high harm crimes.
Shadow Minister Sarah Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Shadow Home Secretary will speak of the violence last night in his remarks. I simply want to say this. There is never an excuse for violence, and as Shadow Policing Minister, my thoughts obviously are with the police who were on duty, and I wish them a swift recovery. I want to also associate myself with the remarks, Mr. Speaker, that you made about PC Keith Palmer, and if I may, I also would like to send my best wishes to the Policing Minister. I hope he continues to show no symptoms of COVID-19 and that the virus was not passed on to anyone working in the Home Office. One would hope that is a lesson to him of the importance of sticking to the rules. Mr. Speaker, thousands of women across the land, including the Home Secretary, have spoken of the danger they feel on the streets and the harassment they have suffered. Now is the time for action. The number of stalking and harassment offences recorded by police has more than doubled in 4 years, 500,000 offences last year, and we know that this is literally the tip of the iceberg, as most women do not report street harassment. Will the Home Secretary work cross-party to introduce a law similar to one introduced in France in 2018 to make street harassment a specific criminal offence?
I say to the Honourable Lady on street harassment, and in fact all harassment against individuals, male and female, but particularly women and girls, street harassment is absolutely unacceptable. And Mr. Speaker, I've spent some time actually with campaigners who are campaigning to change the law on street harassment, so I'm absolutely committed to working with everybody on this. This will be part of our strategy going forward on violence against women and girls. The Honourable Lady will absolutely know of the work that's taking place with the VOG consultation right now. We're going to build upon that. We're going to look at all the calls that come in to look at how we can have a proper strategy that will formulate legislation to bring about the changes that women and girls quite rightly want to see.
We now have a substantive question to Minister Foster.
Home Office officials meet weekly with the Strategic Migration Partnership in Northern Ireland to discuss intake, accommodation and other operational matters relating to asylum accommodation. This is supplemented with formal monthly meetings with the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, Belfast City Council, the voluntary and community sector, public health colleagues and the Police Service of Northern Ireland.
Let's go to Claire Hammer. Claire.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Asylum seekers in Northern Ireland are disadvantaged by a lack of parity in specialist services like trauma counselling and legal advice. But instead of plugging these gaps, this minister seems obsessed with introducing ever more punitive and dehumanising policies in her approach to dealing with people fleeing persecution. We've seen the outworkings of offshore processing in Australia, which cost lives and hundreds of millions of pounds and was a human rights disaster. Will the minister take this opportunity to confirm that the department is not pursuing plans to use third countries as dumping grounds, and will they instead commit to establishing safe and legal routes and housing with dignity those who need asylum in the UK?
Minister Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have to say it's disappointing to hear the tone of the Honourable Member's question when compared to Belfast City Council being the only part of Northern Ireland to act as a dispersal area. Securing suitable accommodation does rely on local communities taking part. Perhaps the Honourable Member may wish to reflect on what more councils where the SDLP has a presence could do in terms of action to match her words.
Right, we have a substantive question now to Minister Malthouse.
Mr. Speaker, just before I answer the question, can I reassure the Honourable Lady for Croydon that I did follow the rules, in fact, and I would urge her and indeed all members to get themselves regularly tested on a random basis whether they've got any symptoms or not. Mr. Speaker, the government currently has no plans to misuse the Drugs Act, to review the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971. We keep drugs controls under review, obviously, in consultation with the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs. But drugs legislation is only part of our wider approach to preventing drug misuse, an approach which includes focusing on education in schools, promoting treatment and recovery, and preventing the supply of illicit drugs.
Let's go to Alan Dorrans. Alan.
As a former police officer on the Metropolitan Police, may I pay tribute to the memory of PC Keith Palmer. Mr. Speaker, the largest review ever undertaken of 349 research studies from across the globe carried out by the Centre for Criminology at the University in South Wales in 2017 found that safe or supervised injection rooms significantly reduced drug-related harms and dramatically cut mortality. Will the Minister pay heed to this overwhelming evidence and support at least one, or preferably more, pilot facilities for safe drug consumption rooms in Scotland?
Right, let's go to Minister Malthouse. Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can understand the honourable gentleman's concern, given that Scotland currently has a drug death rate 3.5 times the rate of the whole of the UK, and it's a matter of that should be of concern to all of us. I have had extensive discussions with my Scottish colleagues, not least the new Minister for Drugs, about how we could work together to try and tackle this problem. And while at the moment we don't envisage changing the rules to look at safe consumption rooms, there is a huge amount that we can do together. And I would urge him, and indeed his colleagues north of the border, to look at our groundbreaking ADA projects, which are bringing together police and the most critical partner for drug recovery, which is the health service, in 5 areas across England and Wales, to really focus on this problem and try and shift the numbers.
Right, we now have a substantive question to Minister Phil.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I will group questions 11 and 12. Removing people who should not be here is vital in order to maintain the integrity of our immigration system. And in particular, removing dangerous foreign national offenders is critical to protecting our fellow citizens. In the year to June 2020, there were 5,208 enforced removals. However, that was significantly lower than in previous years, and that is why we're going to be bringing forward proposals very shortly to reform the system to make sure we can better enforce our immigration rules.
Right, let's go to Richard Holden. Richard.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for his answer. My North West Durham constituents want genuine refugees to be supported, but also want to see foreign criminals and bogus asylum seekers deported. We've got members of the local Labour Party here spreading scare stories about the plans for the Hassock Fields site. So could the Minister confirm that Hassock Fields will be a secure facility, essentially a Category C prison? It'll have around 80 females in for as short a time as possible, and that recruitment of 200 local jobs will start as soon as possible. And finally, will he ignore the calls of the hard left Labour activists who want to have open borders and would allow foreign criminals to stay in the UK and ensure that those people who have no right to be here are deported as quickly as possible?
Honourable friend is quite right. Where people have valid asylum claims, of course, we should look after them. But where they do not, we should ensure that they leave. The Hassock Fields Centre is indeed designed for 80 female detainees. It will indeed be a secure facility. It will indeed create local jobs, as he says, and only people with no right to stay in the country will be there. And I certainly do join him in condemning the local Labour Party in his neighbourhood who appear to be against proper border control.
Is Bob Blackman there? Bob.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend will well know of the frustration that exists when violent criminals who are foreign nationals leave prison and are due to be deported, only for their lawyers to frustrate the process with last-minute appeals. Will my honourable friend bring forward proposals to prevent this action and make sure those dangerous criminals who are a threat to this country are deported at the end of their criminal convictions?
Well, my honourable friend is quite right. Dangerous criminals, including murderers and rapists, should be deported once their sentence is over. I'm afraid the honourable member is right. We do face legal challenges, often very late in the day, often despite the fact there have been many opportunities to make those claims before, the vast majority of which, well over 80%, subsequently turn out to be totally without merit. And it is for that reason that the Home Secretary and I will be bringing forward proposals in the very near future to address exactly this issue.
Shadow Minister Conor McGinn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We learned this month that under this government, the number of foreign criminals living freely in the UK has exceeded 10,000 for the first time ever, while the number deported last year fell to its lowest level on record. But however bad those numbers are, at least they exist, unlike, astonishingly, as I found out today, any figures about the rearrest of previously charged and potentially dangerous terrorist suspect. Mr. Speaker, doesn't this show, and aren't these examples of how, for all their tough talk, this government's record is weak and its competence lacking, and it's a totally unacceptable state of affairs when it comes to the safety and security of the British people?
Well, given the Shadow Minister's newfound concern about deporting foreign national offenders, we'll find out, won't we, very shortly, whether his actions meet his rhetoric in the division lobby when we come to vote on legislation in the relatively near future. And why was it, Mr. Speaker, that when we came to bring forward a charter flight back in December to deport dangerous foreign national offenders, Labour MP after Labour MP stood up opposing that? Completely wrong.
Right, we now have a substantive question to Minister Malthouse. Minister Malthouse.
Mr. Speaker, the Home Office has been working with policing, public and private sector partners to track and mitigate the risk of fraud during the pandemic. The National Cybersecurity Centre has taken down tens of thousands of online scams, and gov.uk is giving the public advice they need to spot and avoid falling victim to scams.
Go to Sharon Hodgson. Sharon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Recent months have seen an increasing number of these scams related to coronavirus vaccine. And as rumours swirl in the press about a delay to the vaccine in the UK, it is even more important that the government takes urgent action to stop fraudulent opportunists from exploiting the vulnerable. With one scam charging for a fake vaccine on the doorstep, can the Minister detail what steps extra to what he's already mentioned the government can take to tackle this dangerous fraud?
Minister Malthouse.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can well understand the Honourable Lady's frustration and fear about this. It's a disgraceful type of crime, particularly as we face this awful pandemic together, for people to be duped by others offering fake vaccine. We are working very closely with partners across health and law enforcement to make sure that we catch up with these villains as quickly as we possibly can. And I've been reassured by the fact that the number of vaccine-related frauds that have been reported are pleasingly still quite low. But we continue to monitor the situation very carefully. And when people do come across this kind of instance, I would urge them, please, to report it to the City of London's Action Fraud as soon as they can.
We now have a substantive question to the Home Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government is committed to recruiting an additional 20,000 police officers by March 2024. And ahead of this recruitment drive, we've already got 6,620 more police officers. The Honourable Lady will also be aware of the significant police funding that has come to her own police force.
Right. Let's head to Kate to learn. Kate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Home Secretary is failing to recognise that Lancashire has lost 750 officers over the last decade and are under a huge amount of pressure, and they simply don't have enough officers to investigate some crimes. This causes great concerns to residents. Does the Home Secretary feel that it is fair on victims of crime? And does she agree with me that justice delayed is justice denied? And has she any concern the public could lose faith in the police unless these concerns are addressed urgently?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Lady is failing to recognise the amount of police funding she's receiving in her own local area in Lancashire. Also, she's failed to recognise the number of new police officers that have been recruited who are out there day in, day out, protecting our streets and her constituents. She speaks about victims, and rightly so, and the support for victims is absolutely crucial, but she must also reflect the role that and the support that victims receive within the wider criminal justice system in relation to particular crimes, particular offences, and also the role of the CPS. And on that basis, I think, Mr. Speaker, it is an absolute shame that she and her party opposite failed to stand up for victims in the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill when that received its second reading last week.
We have a substantive question to the Home Secretary, number 16.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is no place in our society for violence against women and girls, and the honourable gentleman will know that this government is putting in record levels of investment into the police. There are more police officers on the streets. We as a government are absolutely ensuring that there are longer prison sentences for those individuals that commit crimes against women and girls, all of which was opposed by the party opposite.
Let's go to Geraint Davis. Geraint.
Mr. Speaker, our hearts are with the friends and family of Sarah Everard after a tragic and brutal killing at a time that recorded rape has doubled since 2014 and 99% of rapes reported aren't charged. So will the government now enable people to instantly report street nuisance and harassment from their mobile phones in text and in images to allow immediate police intervention? And will she also invest in immediate DNA same-day testing together with Nightingale courts to fast-track rape cases so women are safer and justice is done?
The Honourable Gentleman has highlighted some important points around rapes and sexual violence and abuse within the criminal justice system. I can confirm, Mr. Speaker, that as part of the work of the Crime and Justice Task Force, the government are looking at a range of measures joined up with the Ministry of Justice and also working with the court system as well in terms of how we can do more to fast-track cases, but also make sure that victims are protected in the right kind of way that he has spoken of. And alongside that, of course, there is a great deal of work that's taken place across government with the end-to-end rape review.
We now come to Shadow Minister Jess Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm delighted to hear that the Home Secretary has finally joined up with us in trying to do better for violence against women and girls, and that task force was announced last week. We look forward to working with her. We are hopefully going to enter a new era of on-street harassment thanks to the deeds of Labour women here in the Commons and in the other place who pushed the government to record misogyny as a hate crime. With this in mind, can I ask the Home Secretary what she intends to do to train police forces? And if she can answer why only half of English and Welsh forces have undertaken domestic abuse matters training, even though research shows that where forces have received it, there is a 41% increase in coercive control arrests. The Minister for Safeguarding said over and over again last week that police training was important in improving the dreadful and worsening outcomes for abused women in this country. So how come, under her watch and the watch of the Home Secretary, only half of forces have undergone the necessary proven training? Can the Home Secretary tell the House what she has done to ensure that all are trained, other than just saying she wants them to be? We need deeds, not words. Otherwise, her Home Office will continue to keep releasing more and more violent perpetrators back onto our streets.
Order before we answer. We must make sure that the questions are short in order to get through the list, but I do appreciate how important it is. Home Secretary.
Speaker, well, I'm sorry that the Honourable Lady has taken the tone that she has. And, well, many people are cross, but she should also recognise that this should never become a partisan issue or a party political issue at all. I think, if I may, I appreciate she would like to sit and chunter from the sidelines, but the fact of the matter is, when we look at the work of this House, across all parliamentarians, no one individual holds the licence to determine the actual changes and the outcomes that we collectively want to see for women and girls. Now to answer if she's interested at all in getting justice and driving the right kind of outcomes for women and girls, she would actually listen to what I have to say on this. Mr. Speaker, there is a great deal of work that is taking place. And I'm sorry that the Honourable Lady does not want to listen to the serious points that I'm about to make around government actions. And she sits there pulling faces and nodding her head. I have commissioned, Mr. Deputy Speaker, when it comes to policing, a thematic review in terms of violence against women and girls in policing, which will be led by Her Majesty's Inspectorate. And within that, we'll be looking at the responses of the police in terms of how they deal with these issues. And it is a fact, Mr. Speaker, over the last 12 months, through the National Policing Board, there has been some very strong work that has taken place across police and across 43 police forces to look at the work and the training in conjunction, if the Honourable Lady would like to listen to what I have to say, rather than listen to the sound of her own voice. We are also looking at not just the work of police forces, but with the College of Policing, looking at the training that is in place and where this training needs to be improved. And of course, there are standards within the inspectorate where police forces are held to account. These are important benchmarks that judge the quality, but also judge the outcomes, and it's outcomes that matter to the victims that we all care about, Mr. Speaker, but also to make sure that there are fewer victims in the future, because all of us in this House, irrespective of our political parties, want to ensure that women and girls and victims are safeguarded and protected within the criminal justice system.
18, sir.
Let's go to Minister Malthouse. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we recognise the misery that some unauthorised encampments cause to local communities and businesses. Through the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, we are pleased to now be delivering on our manifesto commitment to strengthen the police's powers to arrest and seize the vehicles of those who set up unauthorised encampments and cause damage, disruption and distress.
Grouped as well. Benevolent.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend will have noticed that last week, in voting against the Police Crime and Sentencing and Courts Bill, the Labour Party also voted against giving the police the powers they need to act quickly and effectively against illegal traveller encampments. Mr. Speaker, the key word there is illegal. Illegal encampments are by definition illegal.
Yeah, exactly.
With illegal encampments popping up across Milton Keynes, does my right honourable friend agree with me that it is wrong to prioritise the rights of criminals and that we are right to be giving the police the powers they need to act and enforce the law?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my apologies. Yes, grouping 18 and 19 together. And the honourable gentleman is exactly right, that we have to balance the rights of so many travellers to lead a nomadic life, and the vast majority do in a legal way, against the rights of those who own property and live in communities and deserve to live without the distress and aggravation and difficulty that comes from unauthorised encampments. He will know that we are a government that does not tolerate law-breaking of any kind, and the measures we're introducing will ensure that the police have the powers they need to tackle this problem, hopefully once and for all.
We now go to Dr. Kieran Mullen. Dr. Mullen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I met recently with a local business that transports food up and down the country from a warehouse in my constituency. Their business was disrupted by an authorised encampment and they were subject to harassment and demands for cash payments. My right honourable friend confirmed that our proposed new laws are aimed at preventing just that type of behaviour, but very importantly, that the vast majority of the traveller community who don't harass or disrupt local communities they travel through face no reduction in their rights.
Minister.
Speaker, the honourable gentleman speaks the truth, and I'm very sorry to hear about the circumstances that have afflicted that business in his community. I know that he works very hard to make sure that his part of the world stays a great one for investment, and I hope that business manages to deal with this problem. But, Mr. Speaker, the country is littered with businesses who've had to put boulders or huge logs or other types of barriers over their hard-standing old car parks. And this is not a situation which we can tolerate into the future. As he says, the vast majority of travellers go about their lifestyle in a perfectly legal manner, and we should facilitate and help them to do so. But those who don't, who cross the line into illegality, need to be dealt with, and we believe the measures that we put forward in the bill will allow the police to do that with much greater efficiency.
Catherine West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of constituents... Number 20, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During the pandemic, the number of accommodated asylum seekers has increased, given we have not been able to move people on from accommodation and continuing claims. This means we have needed to secure contingency accommodation options, including 2 Ministry of Defence sites. We await the Inspector's full report on contingency accommodation, which will lay in Parliament alongside the Department's response after his inspection is concluded.
Councillor West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many constituents have been in touch about the unhygienic conditions at Napier Barracks, including risk of spreading COVID. And I understand that in the Select Committee, the Home Secretary did say that she'd been following guidance, yet it seemed to be the opposite to what the Kent Clinical Commissioning Group said, where they said there are too many people housed in each block to allow adequate social distancing and prevent the risk of spread of infection. Will he once and for all decide that barracks simply are super spreader venues and shouldn't be used for anyone, let alone vulnerable asylum seekers?
Sir Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We expect the highest standards from our providers and have instructed them to make improvements following the interim report for the Independent Chief Inspector. But in the future, a core part of avoiding such pressures that result in the need to use contingency accommodation will be fixing our broken asylum system to ensure decisions are fair by being more prompt, but firmer by ensuring those whose claims are not genuine can be removed more easily.
Right, we now go to SNP spokesperson Stuart C. MacDonald. Stuart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Home Secretary said in committee that advice around dormitories and the use of the accommodation was all based on Public Health England advice, but the inspection report reveals Public Health England had advised opening dormitory-style accommodation at Napier was not supported by current guidance. And while ministers have claimed barracks were good enough for the armed services and certainly more than good enough for people seeking asylum, this report says they are impoverished, run down and unsuitable. So when will these statements be corrected? And more importantly, why didn't the Home Office grasp that the use of dormitory accommodation in the middle of a pandemic was utterly reckless?
Minister.
Well, I note the members' points, but I've already outlined we expect the highest standards from providers and instructed them to make improvements. But a core part of being able to end the use of contingency accommodation in hotels and barracks is having more options and locations for dispersed accommodation. Yet sadly, Glasgow is the only location currently providing this in Scotland. Part of the solution might be for the Honourable Gentleman's Own Council in Cumbernauld, Kilsyth and Kirkintilloch East to agree to be the next on the list, something I hope he will reflect positively on.
Stuart C. MacDonald.
Mr. Speaker, it's well and good for the Minister to ask providers to make improvements, but it's a blindingly obvious fact that whatever you do with dormitory accommodation isn't going to protect against coronavirus. But to fix asylum accommodation, I agree, we need local authorities to have the powers and the funding that they need for the job. And that's what the Home Affairs Committee has said several times. Now, if the Home Office agrees to do that, instead of launching horrendous large-scale warehousing of vulnerable people, more local authorities will get on board, and I will indeed encourage that. But will the Home Office make sure local authorities do get the powers and the funding they need?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, we already see from the contribution Glasgow makes that there is a range of support available. And as we say, we want to end the use of contingency accommodation. It is just that, contingency. And as the pressures are reduced, we've moved away from using, for example, the Penally site. But as touched on, the solution is for more areas to come forward because we do need the local councils to back up sometimes some of the calls they make with their actions.
We now go to Shadow Minister Holly Lynch. Holly.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Independent Inspector's report states very clearly, once one person was infected, a large-scale outbreak was virtually inevitable. In addition, the Kent and Medway CCG inspection report of Napier confirms that some communal areas were cleaned just once a week, that staff were also expected to sleep 3 to a room, and that there were people with pre-existing vulnerabilities, including diabetes, leukemia and TB, accommodated there. The public health advice never supported the use of dormitories. So why is Napier Barracks still open?
Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've already outlined, we've instructed our providers to make improvements. And as we say, we want to reduce the use of contingency accommodation through fixing our broken asylum system. Yeah, I'm sure many will be interested to note the Labour Party's sudden interest and enthusiasm for securing improvements at Napier Barracks. Now they are no longer being used by our armed forces.
We now have a substantive question to Minister Malthouse. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Home Office, alongside other policing partners, continues to provide Cleveland Police with the support it requires through HMIC FRS's Police Performance Oversight Group, a meeting of which I was happy to attend a couple of weeks ago. And Cleveland's funding will increase by up to 7.2 million, in the next year. And as at the 31st of December, they'd recruited an additional 159 officers through our Uplift programme, with a further 70 officers to be recruited in the coming year.
Let's go to Simon Clark. Simon.
Thank you, Cleveland Police. Our Conservative Police and Crime Commissioner candidate, Steve Turner, is rightly calling for a review of the funding allocation formula so that Cleveland can access future rounds of violent reduction unit funding and start to tackle this menace on our streets. Will he meet with Steve Turner and myself to discuss this issue and unlock violence reduction unit funding for Cleveland?
Mr. Malthouse.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman is a doughty, and I have to say, given recent announcements, successful advocate for investment and funding for his part of the world. And I would, of course, be more than happy to meet with him. He is right that Cleveland missed out last time on VOU funding, falling just outside the funding formula. But I'd be happy to talk to him about what we can do to help the Police and Crime Commissioner, which hopefully will be a Conservative after the May elections, but also the Chief Constable, to tackle some of the violent crime that plagues parts of Cleveland and bring it peace and light into the future.
We now have a substantive question to Minister Phil.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This strike at Heathrow is over temporary arrangements which are designed to keep staff safe during coronavirus. There has been a large number of discussions between Border Force and the union, but I am frankly astonished that the trade union are striking over measures designed to protect the health and safety of their own members.
Let's go to Ian Lavery. Ian.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not surprised that you're astonished, but remember the Border Force staff have been on the front line during the pandemic and they played a pivotal role in keeping the country COVID secure. And the imposition of a new roster at Heathrow Airport is creating chaos. It's making staff feel less safe with unavoidable COVID-19 breaches. And as the Minister mentioned, there's been a 96% positive ballot result. The staff are set to walk out next week at a time when the airport's own workers are striking over the shameful fire and rehire abuses. Will the Home Secretary intervene and pause these counterproductive changes and allow proper negotiations to take place with the PCS union before Heathrow Airport grinds to a halt over the Easter holidays?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, these measures have been introduced on a temporary basis for just a few months to protect the health of the Border Force workers, and it is frankly astonishing the union have decided to go on strike. These measures will cease to apply in July. Over 90% of the affected Border Force staff now have rosters which they agree with. So I call on the PCS union to end any proposal to indulge in this completely unnecessary, counterproductive strike, absurdly against measures which are designed to protect their own members.
26 withdrawn, so a substantive question to Minister Foster.
On the 31st of January, we launched a bespoke immigration route for British national overseas status holders and their households, allowing them to come to the UK to live, work and study on a pathway to British citizenship. On the 23rd of February, we also launched a fully digital application process which will allow many applicants to apply from home using a smart device.
Let's go to Bob Seeley. Bob.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. I congratulate the Home Secretary and her ministers on the excellent work with Hong Kong BNOs, and long may that continue. On the wider point of asylum, can I welcome and thank the Secretary of State and her excellent ministerial team for the much-needed reform to the asylum system they're going to bring in, which are going to make the asylum system significantly fairer to the British people. These changes cannot come soon enough. Thank you.
Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. We appreciate the warm endorsement of the Honourable Gentleman for the work that's been done on creating this route that will give actually many millions the opportunity to make their home here in our United Kingdom if they decide that is the right choice for them and their family. And we look forward to working with our colleagues in the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government and local councils and the devolved administrations to ensure there is a warm welcome across our United Kingdom for those who arrive here under this new settlement route.
We have a substantive question to Minister Malthouse.
Mr. Speaker, with permission, I'll group question 28 and 29. The Home Office is working closely with the Treasury on the future funding of violence reduction units. And in February this year, we announced further VRU funding of £35.5 million for the coming year, bringing the total investment to £105.5 million over 3 financial years.
Right. Let's just go across to Helen Hayes. Helen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government's own guidance for violence reduction units requires them to generate long-term solutions to violence reduction. Can I therefore ask the Minister why the government only announces piecemeal funding for violence reduction units 1 year at a time, which makes it impossible to plan with certainty for long-term interventions? When does the government plan to embed the work of violence reduction units within mainstream long-term funding commitments so that this vital work, including with some of the most vulnerable and traumatised young people, can be guaranteed for as long as it is needed?
We now go to Minister Malthouse. Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we do recognise the need to put VRUs on a sustainable funding basis. And the Honourable Lady is quite right that much of the work they do is multi-year and needs to be reflected in the investment that we make. We are working closely with Treasury colleagues, and we can hope for a multi-year financial settlement which would allow us to move to that position. Having said that, it is also incumbent upon wider organisations involved in fighting violence, like, for example, the Mayor of London, to embed this kind of work as part of their day-to-day addressing of crime, particularly working closely with young people. And I would urge her to lobby City Hall to mainstream the violence reduction unit as part of their activity, rather than rely on Westminster funding, although we will, of course, support the capital very substantially, as we have been doing in the past.
Right. Let us go to Alex Cunningham. Alex.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Even when the promised 150 police officers are recruited to the Cleveland force, we will still have 350 fewer police than in 2010, and that in an area where the rate of serious violent crime is amongst the highest in England. Unlike others, Cleveland hasn't received additional funds to tackle it. The government now well known for the bizarre rationale for allocating funding for all manner of things in order to favour areas with Tory MPs. But will the Minister now do the right and mature thing and say that Cleveland gets the support the area desperately needs?
Can we go to the Minister? Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I said in my previous answer, I'm meeting certainly a Conservative MP to talk about what more we could do to support Cleveland. And I think it's very unfair of the honourable gentleman to reflect on the experience of his force in that way. We've put significant extra funding into Cleveland Police to allow them to uplift the number of police officers. They are benefiting from wider money that we're spending across the whole country on things like county lines, from which Cleveland sadly suffers, along with other parts of the country, to deal with that particular drugs problem. And that's against an overall spending commitment for UK policing, which is the largest we've seen for a decade, and has been for 2 successive years. So I don't think anybody can accuse this government of stinting or skimping on investment in the police, quite the reverse. And I hope and believe that as Cleveland Police emerges from a difficult period in its history with a strong Chief Constable, that he will start to feel the benefit on his streets quite soon.
We now come to top titles to the Home Secretary.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd just like to make a statement following the incidences over the weekend, and in particularly on the anarchic and violent scenes that we saw in Bristol last night. We have been clear that to save lives and fight this pandemic, people must not currently hold large gatherings. Too many this weekend selfishly decided that this did not apply to them. We will always give the police the support and the protection that they need. And it is sad, as we saw last week, that the opposition voted against measures to protect our police and also introduce longer sentences. The scenes, Mr. Speaker, in Bristol yesterday were utterly shameful. We saw criminal thuggery and disorder caused by a minority who put lives at risk. And our exceptional and brave police officers put themselves in harm's way to protect the public. For them to face the criminal violence against them while upholding the law is completely unacceptable. My thoughts are with the injured officers and their family. And Mr. Speaker, I hope that every single member of Parliament in this House will join me in condemning the shameful actions of the criminal minority involved.
In Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am sure everybody will join the Home Secretary in condemning what were evil and shameful acts yesterday. There are no two ways about that. And the simple truth is that those evil and shameful acts demonstrated only too clearly the need for the police to have powers to deal with disruptive, dangerous actions masquerading behind the right to demonstrate, and that she's right to promote that. That being said, many of us, I suspect including her, view the right to demonstrate peacefully as a foundation stone of our democracy. And can she give the House an undertaking that before we get to report stage, we will make sure that the right to demonstrate peacefully is absolutely guaranteed in our law.
My friend, Mr. Speaker, is absolutely right that the right to protest peacefully is in fact a cornerstone of our democracy, and it is one that this government will always defend. He references the point in relation to bill and legislation that is coming forward. He will know my views. I will work with everybody to make sure that where the police need the powers to tackle the type of appalling thuggery and criminality that we saw yesterday, we will achieve that while absolutely protecting the right to protest peacefully in our country.
Home Secretary Nick Thomason.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd firstly like to pass on the thoughts of we on these benches to police officers and to local residents who were victims of the unacceptable and inexcusable violence we saw in Bristol yesterday. Officers should never face that kind of behaviour as they undertake their work to keep us all safe, and anyone involved in those violent and appalling scenes should face the consequences of their actions. Mr. Speaker, I'd also like to pay tribute, along with the whole House, to the victims of the Westminster Bridge attack 4 years ago today, and to the memory of PC Keith Palmer, who was tragically killed outside this House, protecting all of us and our democracy. Mr. Speaker, in recent weeks, we've heard extraordinarily powerful testimony from women and girls about the level of violence and abuse they continue to face. Now is the time to act decisively, to address the appalling behaviour on our streets that cause distress and intimidation. Now, in answer to the policing minister, the Home Secretary spoke about a strategy, which of course we will contribute to recommend legislation, but action is urgent. So will the Home Secretary work with me to introduce a specific law on street harassment and tougher sentences for stalking?
Well, I agree with the honourable member's remarks, obviously in light of the tragedy that we all saw with regards to the tragic events and the attacks here in Westminster. I would like to refer the honourable gentleman to my comments that I made to the Shadow Policing Minister earlier on. I'm sorry that it's taken so long for the party opposite to actually contribute to the survey on violence against women and girls. And I think the importance of this survey is absolutely fundamental so that we take a balanced approach. And it's all very well to say that we need action right now, but there is action taking place. It is important that we listen to people. It's also important that we engage with those affected by violence against women and girls, street harassment, unacceptable harassment and abuse that takes place against women and girls. We are absolutely going to work with everybody involved in this. I don't think this should become a partisan or party political issue one bit, Mr. Speaker. And I would like our work and our strategy and the legislation that we will bring forward to build very much upon the work that this government has led already when it comes to protecting women and girls, whether it's on issues such as stalking protection orders, sexual risk orders, the introduction of Clare's Law, and also the fact that we now have a landmark domestic abuse bill going to Parliament.
The problem is, Mr. Speaker, that the longer you wait, the worse the situation becomes. More than 2 years have passed since this government announced its end-to-end rape review, and there's been no action. And in that time, rape convictions have now shamefully fallen to the worst on record, an all-time record low. Systemic change is needed, but action is urgently required. So let me put another suggestion to the Home Secretary. Will she commit to working cross-party to create new specialised rape and serious sexual offence units in every police force in England and Wales now?
Well, the honourable gentleman disparagingly dismisses the end-to-end rape review that is taking place, Mr. Speaker. And Yes, and it has taken time, and once the Honourable Gentleman reads the review, he might understand why it's taken time. There is extensive work taking place with the individuals that are contributing and have contributed to the rape review. And I'm sure of all people, Mr Deputy Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman will recognise many of the sensitive issues around rape and the handling of rape cases. And it's right, it is absolutely right and proper that we as a government give the time, the space, but also the ability for those that want to contribute to be able to contribute in a very candid way. That is how we can shape legislation to drive the right kind of outcomes, and not, Mr Deputy Speaker, just saying that we need action now and just coming up with ideas that will just make people feel better at this particular moment.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. You may not be aware, but my right honourable friend is an adopted daughter of Stoke-on-Trent, having formerly lived there whilst at Keele University. The people of Stoke-on-Trent are proud of their Home Secretary because she backs our police, sides with the victims of crime, and speaks for the law-abiding citizens of Stoke-on-Trent North, Kidsgrove and Tork. So does my right honourable friend agree with me that there could be no better second home for the Home Office than in the city of Stoke-on-Trent, bringing in with it well-paid jobs and investment, delivering on our commitment to level up Stoke-on-Trent?
My honourable friend has tapped into my absolute affection for Stoke-on-Trent, and he's done that with great flair this afternoon, Mr Speaker. He is right. His constituents are brilliant individuals, and I've been to Stoke-on-Trent many times. They saw sense by voting for more Conservative members of Parliament at the last election, I should also say. We are in fact scoping new locations for a second site for the Home Office, and we are going to go beyond the conventional government footprints and sites, and I can confirm that we are looking now at long-term plans, and I will absolutely share with my honourable friend and the House in due course what our proposals will be.
Let's go to the Chair of the Select Committee, Yvette Cooper. Yvette.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I join with the Home Secretary and Shadow Home Secretary in paying tribute to PC Keith Palmer, who lost his life keeping us safe 4 years ago, and also in sending support to the Avon and Somerset officers injured in the unacceptable violence in Bristol yesterday. Scientists estimate that there are now up to 2,000 new cases of the South Africa variant a day in France. So can the Home Secretary tell us how many of the 15,000 people arriving in the UK each day are travelling here from France? And does she intend to put France on the red list?
Will know that when it comes to red listing countries, that is a matter for my colleague in the Department of Transport and also with the Department of Health. She's absolutely right, though, however, to point to the prevalence of the South African variant in France, and on that reason and basis, she will understand that is why we have effective measures in place at the border with compliance checks and upstream checks as well for people that are travelling to the United Kingdom, and alongside that, measures in place to test road hauliers, which the Honourable Lady will also be aware of, we have been doing in Kent.
We now go to Cheryl Murray. Cheryl.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In my own police area, our excellent Police and Crime Commissioner, Alison Hernandez, piloted an allowance for our hard-working special constables who did a set amount of hours over the winter months. Would the department work with her to enable police forces to use the special constabulary as a paid reserve, in the same way as the Army Reserves, to provide additional resource at times of need?
Secretary.
Raises what is an excellent point and an important one. And also, if I may, I'd like to praise the work of her Police and Crime Commissioner for the work that she is doing around special constables. Currently, we have no plans to set up a formal police reserve. However, the Honourable Lady will know we are seeing more and more special constables join in to become full-time police officers. We're working with them. We're also looking at new protections for them. And of course, it's absolutely right that local forces should have the ability to reward volunteers for their valuable contributions, and that is something that I fully back.
Let's go to Sarah Elwyn. Sarah.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Earlier this month, the inquest into the death of Leon Briggs finally reported. 7 years after his death, it showed that neglect and the way the police restrained Leon more than minimally contributed to his death. As well as this, Leon's family have said, and I quote, they think race very much was an issue. What action is being taken so that no family has to face this tragedy again or wait 7 years to know how their loved one died? And what is her department doing to tackle racism in the justice system?
The Honourable Lady raises an incredibly important issue around equality and the fair treatment of individuals in the justice system. There is a great deal of work taking place across both the Home Office and the MOJ, but specifically in relation to policing, this does come back to much of the police training, the work that we do with the college, the work that our forces do as well, not just in terms of when they recruit, but how they constantly train individuals. I would just like to finally, Mr. Speaker, say that I am very sorry in terms of the time that it has taken for the Briggs family to receive justice. 7 years is far too long, and clearly we want to stop such appalling time periods and for families to be left in limbo for such an unacceptable period of time.
Let's go to Ian Levy. Ian.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And this is a matter very close to my heart. Last year, 12-year-old Charlie Patterson, one of my constituents, tragically took her own life after horrific abuse she received online from her peers. Will my right honourable friend do all she can to encourage social media companies to take action straight away to tackle harmful content or activity? And would she please meet with me to discuss Charlie's case and the campaign her family have launched surrounding this?
I'll absolutely meet with the Honourable Gentleman to discuss Charlie Patterson's case, and also, if the opportunity arises, to meet with the family as well. These are tragic cases, and I'm so saddened and sorry to hear of the case that the Honourable Gentleman has raised. And there is so much more work that is required by social media companies. There is extensive work taking place across government, and in fact, I'll also speak to the Secretary of State for DCMS, because we are looking to introduce the Online Harms Bill, the legislation, and it is across government. We need to come together to hold these media companies, social media companies, to account, because, Mr. Speaker, it is a tragedy. There are so many of us that have constituents and know of constituents that have suffered in the same way in which the Patterson family has, and that is wrong. We need to stop that.
Let's go to Christine Jardine. Christine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. There are reports today of a specialist COVID infection control specialist in the NHS facing deportation from the UK, potentially. At the moment, I have a bill before Parliament expressing the desire that those who work in the front line and have put their lives on risk have the right to remain in this country indefinitely. Can the Home Secretary assure me that this matter will be given some consideration by her government in light of the sacrifices that people have made?
The Honourable Lady is absolutely right, and I thank her for raising the case. I will look at the specific case that she has spoken about, but she is right. There are many measures that we have undertaken to ensure that those from overseas that are on the front line in the NHS are supported, and we've made various changes to ensure that they can stay, but I'd happily look at the case you referred.
Question, Jacob Young.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year, you were more likely to be a victim of violent crime in Cleveland than anywhere else in the country. Does the Home Secretary agree with me that it's vital that we end Labour's run of Cleveland Police and elect a Conservative Police and Crime Commissioner, Steve Turner, on May the 6th? And will she visit Teesside to meet our 159 new police officers doing all they can to make our area safe?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You bet, absolutely. And my honourable friend will absolutely know of the support that we are giving to Cleveland Police in particular, that have had a particularly difficult time. But I will join him and others campaigning to absolutely get the right outcome in the Police and Crime Commissioner elections.
I'm now suspending the House for 2 minutes to allow the necessary arrangements to be made for the next business order. Now come to the statement. I call the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, to make the statement. Foreign Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. With permission, I'd like to make a statement about the treatment of the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. This is one of the worst human rights crises of our time, and I believe the evidence is clear as it is sobering. It includes satellite imagery, survivor testimony, official documentation, and indeed leaks from the Chinese government itself, credible open source reporting, including from Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, visits by British diplomats to the region that have corroborated other reports about the targeting of specific ethnic groups. And Mr. Speaker, in sum, the evidence points to a highly disturbing programme of repression. Expressions of religion have been criminalised. Uyghur language and culture discriminated against on a systematic scale. There is widespread use of forced labour. Women forcibly sterilised. Children separated from their parents. An entire population subject to surveillance, including collection of DNA, use of facial recognition software, and so-called predictive policing algorithms. State control in the region is systemic. Over 1 million people have been detained without trial. There are widespread claims of torture and rape in the camps based on first-hand survivor testimony. People are detained for having too many children, for praying too much, for having a beard or wearing a headscarf, for having the wrong thoughts. I'm sure the whole House will join with me in condemning such appalling violations of the most basic human rights. Mr. Speaker, in terms of scale, it's the largest mass detention of an ethnic or religious group since the Second World War. And I believe one thing is clear: the international community cannot simply look the other way. Mr. Speaker, it's been 2.5 years since the UN Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination called on China to stop arbitrarily detaining Uyghurs and other minorities in the Xinjiang province. And it's over 18 months since the UK first led the first ever joint UN statement on Xinjiang at the General Assembly's Third Committee back in October 2019. The number of countries now willing to speak out collectively has grown from just 23 to 39 as the evidence has accumulated and as our diplomatic efforts have borne fruit. And this is a clear signal to China about the breadth of international concern. Last year, 50 independent UN experts spoke out about the situation in an exceptional joint statement calling on China to respect basic human rights. Last month at the Human Rights Council, I led the calls on China to give the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, or some other fact-finding expert, urgent, unfettered access to Xinjiang. Since then, Ms. Bachelet herself has reinforced in the clearest terms the need for independent access to verify the deteriorating situation. So, Mr. Speaker, we regret that instead of recognising those calls from the international community, China has simply sought to deny them. Chinese authorities have claimed that the legitimate concerns raised are fake news. At the same time, the authorities continue to expand prison facilities, surveillance networks, and forced labour programmes. And China continues to resist access to the UN or other independent experts to verify the truth, notwithstanding their blanket denials. Mr. Speaker, for the UK's part, our approach has been to call out these egregious industrial-scale human rights abuses, work with our international partners, and ultimately match words with actions. So in January, I announced a package of measures to help ensure that no British organisations, government or private sector, deliberately or inadvertently, can profit from human rights violations against the Uyghurs or other minorities, and that no businesses connected with the internment camps can do business in the UK. Today we're taking further steps, again in coordination with our international partners. Having very carefully considered the evidence against the criteria in our global human rights sanctions regime, I can tell the House today that I'm designating 4 senior individuals responsible for the violations that have taken place and persist against the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. Alongside these individuals, we're also designating the Public Security Bureau of the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps. That's the organisation, Mr. Speaker, responsible for enforcing the repressive security policies across many areas of Xinjiang. The sanctions involve travel bans and asset freezes against the individuals and asset freeze against the entity we're designating. The individuals are barred from entering the UK. Any assets found in the UK will be frozen. We take this action alongside the EU, the US and Canada, who are all taking similar measures today. And I think it's clear that by acting with our partners, 30 of us in total, we are sending the clearest message to the Chinese government that the international community will not turn a blind eye to such serious and systematic violations of basic human rights, and that we will act in concert to hold those responsible to account. Mr. Speaker, as the Prime Minister set out in the integrated review last week, China is an important partner in tackling global challenges like climate change. We pursue a constructive dialogue where that proves possible, but we will always stand up for our values, and in the face of evidence of such serious human rights violations, we will not look the other way. The suffering of the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang cannot be ignored. Human rights violations on this scale cannot be ignored. Together with our partners, we call on China to end these cruel practices, and I commend this statement to the House.
We now come to the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Lisa Nandy.
Speaker, there is no question that this is a welcome step, and may I welcome the moves by the EU today and other partners. I'm sure the whole House will stand in solidarity with our fellow European parliamentarians who've been sanctioned by the Chinese government in response. This is an unacceptable attack on democratic lawmakers simply for highlighting the horrific evidence from Xinjiang. But, Mr. Speaker, the Foreign Secretary has just read out the evidence that we have known about for years, which he rightly called barbaric. But for years, when it has come to taking concrete steps, he hasn't listened. He didn't listen to his honourable friends, the members for Wealden or Chingford and Wood Green. He didn't listen to us. He didn't listen to the Board of Deputies. He didn't listen to the Uyghur Congress. And suddenly, today, the Foreign Secretary has found a newfound sense of urgency about the desperate plight of the Uyghur, despite that mounting evidence over several years. The truth is that the timing of this is grubby and it is cynical. It is designed to send a signal, first and foremost, not to the Chinese government, but to his own backbenchers. It is motivated primarily by a desire to protect the government, not the Uyghur. For all the talk of being a force for good in the world, it is only when this government is staring down the barrel of defeat that it discovers a moral centre. Only now that the US and the EU have acted is he finally moved to take this step. And I would urge all members, especially those brave and conscientious members opposite, to think carefully before accepting that this signals a change of approach from this government. This week, we learned that despite his protestations, the Foreign Secretary has been talking up a trade deal with China in private at gatherings with Beijing officials. This week, the Prime Minister launched his Global Britain policy, signalling a closer economic relationship with China. Members had eagerly awaited details of the Indo-Pacific tilt. We didn't dream for a moment that from the talk that we've had over the last year that it would be a tilt towards China. Today is perhaps the most acute example of the government's decade-long incoherent, inconsistent approach to the Chinese government, that on the day he finally announces sanctions on some of the officials responsible for human rights abuses in Xinjiang, he is also pulling every trick in the book to stop Parliament gaining the power to block any bilateral trade or investment agreement with China based on a determination of genocide. So I would just ask honourable members to pause and ask, if this is about coordination, why has it taken so long? The government could have taken coordinated action with the United States when it brought sanctions in July last year, or if it felt so strongly, it could have moved independently from the EU as it has done in sanctions on other countries over the last year. Where are the sanctions on officials in Hong Kong when the US took this step this week? We should be taking a leadership approach, given our historical commitments and the bilateral treaty which China is in breach of. We are signatories to the joint declaration, not the United States. Where is the tougher sanctions regime that brings corruption into scope? Why did the Foreign Secretary say that he had no reason to think that we couldn't deepen our trading relationship with China at a private gathering earlier this month? Why did the Prime Minister say last month that he was committed to strengthening the UK's ties with China, whatever the occasional political difficulties? And if this signals a change in approach, why on earth on the same day as the government is announcing these sanctions, is it twisting the arms of backbenchers who want to support the Genocide Amendment? Mr. Speaker, today I urge all parliamentarians to stand firm, to stand with the public who overwhelmingly support a principled stance on genocide, to stand with their consciences, and most of all to stand with the Uyghur people. After a decade of rolling out the red carpet to Beijing and turning a blind eye to human rights abuses, this is the moment when we will finally force a change in Britain's foreign policy, live up to our values as a country, and be a force for good in the world.
Foreign Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think she welcomed the step, notwithstanding everything that she said that followed. But let me just correct some of the, frankly, false statements she made. First of all, she says that I talked up an FTA with China.
So, can I just say, a false statement? I don't think anybody would deliberately make a false statement, will they? No, but you said false, and I'm not sure it was false. And just to say, I'm not quite sure we got all the script that was read out either. Certainly my pages didn't match what was said, and I'm not sure whether it was the same for the Shadow Foreign Secretary, in which case we all might feel a little aggrieved if we didn't see the full script. It was only when you read it out I realised the pages weren't corresponding. Foreign Secretary.
On the first point, I'm certainly not imputing bad faith, but it is wholly inaccurate what she said, and I will correct the record shortly. In relation to the statement, the only bit that has been removed was reference to the individual sanction, because for legal and propriety reasons we cannot give that out in advance. So I hope he will accept my apologies for that, but we were doing it not to frustrate the very purpose of the sanctions. In relation to the remarks that the rather selective snippets, it is wholly inaccurate to suggest that I talked up an FTA with China. I made it very clear that there was no realistic or foreseeable prospects of an FTA, and that the way that we would deepen our trade with China was for China to improve its human rights records. On the one hand, the Honourable Lady welcomes the fact that we've proceeded in concert with, in total, 30 partners, including ourselves. On the other hand, she says it's too slow. It's the Goldilocks of criticism. She suggests it was linked to the trade bill. I have to say to the Honourable Lady, I know she believes in human rights. And I know that actually, I had hoped at least, she would recognise that today is an important moment. 30 countries imposing targeted sanctions on China for human rights abuses is an important moment. It is a bit disappointing to hear her trying to score political points in relation to this important step, let alone suggesting that the concerted and unprecedented action of 30 countries abroad is somehow tied up with the UK's domestic legislative timetable. The reality is, in relation to the Genocide Amendment, is that we absolutely recognise this House is ability to hold to account this government, and through support for the Neil Amendment and further concessions, we continue to want to see maximum government scrutiny by Parliament. And the reality, again, Mr. Speaker, is that this government, this British government under this Prime Minister, has done more to stand up for human rights around the world than any previous British government. We've demonstrated that through our diplomatic leadership in the Human Rights Council and in the UN General Assembly and the Third Committee. We've demonstrated it through the actions we're taking on modern slavery. We've demonstrated it on the offer we've made to the BNOs from Hong Kong, and we demonstrated it again today with these Magnitsky sanctions.
Right, let's go to the Chair of the Select Committee, Tom Tugendhat. Tom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome the announcement of sanctions that the Foreign Secretary has made this afternoon. And he knows that he's got no greater supporters on this decision than the Foreign Affairs Committee. But could I ask for a gentleman who's devoted so much of his career to human rights law, what is it in the human rights law or in the UN definition of genocide that fails to get him to use the word in this circumstance? My understanding, and I admit I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is that the attempted destruction of a people or its culture in whole or in part constitutes genocide. And what he has just described to the House sounds to me like it fits that definition. So I'm just wondering why he is reticent to use the word. And given that he has quite rightly identified that sanctions on individuals operating in the UK are a matter of great concern, could he please let the House know when he intends to bring forward a Foreign Agents Registration Act? As he knows as well as I do, sadly, there are too many people in the UK, British people, sometimes even sadly former ministers or those connected to government, who are using their influence in a surreptitious manner to further the aims or interests of a country like China that is so violating human rights.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank my honourable friend, the chair of the Select Committee? There will be ample time for further discussions of the trade bill, but the arguments around genocide and the importance of it being determined by a court are well rehearsed. Equally, as we've made clear, the importance of this House controlling the executive in relation to free trade policy. In relation to further legislation, an announcement will be made by relevant Secretary of State in due course.
Right, let us go to SNP spokesperson Chris Law. Chris. Oh dear.
SNP wholly condemns human rights violations taking place in China. Last week, the Prime Minister published a long-awaited integrated review which stated, and I quote, "Our first goal is to support open societies and defend human rights as a force for good in the world." Yet despite this, the Prime Minister wants to forge closer ties to some of the worst human rights violating states in our world. Moreover, in the immediate aftermath of the review's publication, the Foreign Secretary lamented that restricting trade because of human rights abuses would mean missing out on growth markets. The Foreign Secretary's remarks last week do not chime with today's statement. His insistence that the UK will seek to do trade deals with countries that violate standards enshrined in European Convention on Human Rights, the very laws drawn up by British officials after the horrors of the Second World War, marked yet another record low for this UK government. China is a serial human rights violator, and we must call out the appalling state-backed human rights violations taking place there. Mr. Speaker, it's crystal clear. It's genocide. Indeed, the think tank New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy found that through its actions in Xinjiang, China has breached every single article of the UN Genocide Convention and has accused China of clearly demonstrating, and I quote, intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial or religious group. Shamefully, this UK government refused to back the genocide amendment to the trade bill, making it clear its desire for a trade deal with China as opposed to a tough approach on human rights is preferable. The Foreign Secretary can talk tough on China, but until he takes action, this does nothing for those living under oppression in Xinjiang and elsewhere. So can the Foreign Secretary tell this House and the world what specific actions he intends to take to ensure the UK upholds human rights, that this is a new approach that will not be characterised by the inconsistency, ambiguity and policy coherence that's been defined by this government so far? And finally, will he call out what is happening in China is quite simply genocide?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Gentleman made a whole range of remarks which suggest he lives in a parallel university. I have to say, some of what he said is just pure nonsense. I made clear we would never do an FTA with a country that's had a human rights record that is beyond the pale. We've demonstrated through the recent action we're taking under the Modern Slavery Act, and particularly in relation to supply chains, that we will not allow businesses that profit either here or abroad to do business in the UK. And we've obviously introduced the Magnitsky sanctions. He raises the question about whether we would ever trade with countries who do not have ECHR level human rights. I would just put it to him that he has never once, nor has the Honourable Lady, suggested that we should tear up any of the free trade deals that we do with countries that still have the death penalty, which of course wouldn't comply with ECHR. If he wants to keep making this argument, can you tell me which of the FTAs, whether it's Korea, Japan, or is it negotiations with the US, that he's opposed to?
Right, let's go to Flick Drummond. Flick.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for his much welcome statement? And does he agree with me that it's because a Conservative government put in place Magnitsky legislation that we're able to make these designations, and that by working closely with the United States, the EU and others, we can lead the charge against authoritarian regimes which have a poor human rights record?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and of course the real significance today is not just the groundbreaking measures that we're taking, but there are 30 other countries taking action in concert. We're far more likely to have impact that way. We're far more likely to get China to think twice.
Let's go to Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I thank the Foreign Secretary for his statement, and I'm glad that this government and others are now taking the treatment of Uyghur people seriously and the violations of their human rights. Could he tell us what action has been taken over the historic profits made by British companies from manufacturing that's been done in that part of China? And by the same token, will he also undertake that the UN requests about treatment of people who are being discriminated against, such as the Dalit peoples in India, Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh, will also be included in advice given to British companies so that we are not profiting from the abuse of human rights in any country around the world? Because if we are then putting ourselves in further violation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Good. Can I thank the honourable gentleman? The one point he makes there, which is an important and focused point, is the requirements under the Modern Slavery Act, particularly around transparency of supply chains, apply across the board. He's absolutely right on that, and it's something where we ought to work with business, but ultimately be willing to fine businesses if they don't comply.
Mr. Speaker, what China has been doing to the Uyghur people and others, including the Tibetans, is nothing short of absolutely appalling. And frankly, like the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee said, we're dancing elaborately around the whole idea of genocide when it's quite clear that is what is going on. Can I, however, congratulate my right honourable friend on making this statement. He knows that I and many others in this place have called for this for some time, and so I welcome it. But can I also ask him, two people that are not on this list, as I understand it. Chen Guangguo, who is the political commissar of the infamous Xinjiang Production Construction Corps, which are on the list, but not him, the architect of what's going on in Tibet and in Xinjiang. Can you please take that into consideration? Finally, the buck for all of this stops with the president of China, who was recently quoted as saying about the Uyghur people that they, the Chinese, should show them no mercy. When do we start calling his name up?
Can I thank my right honourable friend? Can I first of all pay tribute to his campaigning efforts in this regard? I know it will feel no small sense of accomplishment today because he has very eloquently and powerfully made the case in the House. I will certainly look at any names that he's got. Of course, we have a very clear, specific legal regime. I have to assess, and the government has to assess the evidence based on it, but we should be willing to call out. And I think that the action that we've taken both today, but also more generally with the Magnitsky sanctions regime, shows that we are not afraid not just to talk, but also to act.
Right, let's go to Alistair Carmichael. Alistair.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I also give a warm welcome to this announcement of these sanctions? They have been long sought for, and they're welcome now that they finally arrived. Can I say to the Foreign Secretary that while he's on our roll, we might possibly see some positive announcement with regard to the Alton Amendment later on today, since he's got a taste for this. But will he also give urgent consideration to the recent report from the Bees Select Committee, which came forward with good and constructive suggestions about how to tackle the issue of the use of Uyghur slavery in the supply chain of many goods that are available in this country, including the possible linking of that eventually to the disqualification of directors?
Can I thank the right honourable gentleman for welcoming the action we've taken today, and more generally in relation to the committee's reports, say how important it is, as I mentioned already in relation to the previous question, how important it is that we take action on supply chains, because often, particularly I think in relation to the internment camps in Xinjiang, which are profiting, the best source of action is to follow the money, to cut it off, and to prevent those who are profiting from making money out of it. And certainly, if they do so, it should not be through UK companies or through UK consumers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I thank my right honourable friend for his statement and certainly welcome the sanctions on the Chinese regime. Could my right honourable friend advise the House what steps is he and the UK government taking with our Five Eyes partners to coordinate a response to China's appalling aggression and human rights abuses?
Quite right. Foreign Secretary.
Can I thank my honourable friend? Well, she would have noticed that we've taken action with our Canadian, US counterparts. We also have engaged very closely with the Australian, my Australian opposite number. They have legislation that is being actively considered at the moment, and I've also had engagement with my New Zealand opposite number. The Five Eyes is important, the EU is important. Actually, what we really need to do is broaden the caucus of countries like-minded on values who will take action and have the courage to stand up for these important universal rights.
Let's go to Jim Shannon. Jim.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Secretary of State for his strong action within the statement today. China's systematic persecution and abuse of Uyghurs and Christians and Buddhists in Nepal is outrageous and despicable. Following on from the latest news that the EU have imposed sanctions upon Chinese officials due to what some of us are terming as a genocide of Uyghurs, will the Secretary of State outline what discussions have taken place with global powers to send a joint message that the removal of children from their parents and being sent to orphan camps will not be tolerated by the global community, and that these words will be followed up with economic action? Thank you.
I thank the honourable gentleman, and just say to him, I absolutely share his concerns. Those are some of the appalling violations of human rights that I set out before the House today. It is they clearly violate the most basic human rights protected, not just under domestic law, but international human rights law. And we've taken sanctions in part in response to the evidence related to them, and we will continue to. They are some of the worst and most egregious violations that we've seen.
Jacob.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Foreign Secretary for his statement and for his long-standing personal commitment to upholding human rights around the world. What steps has he taken to rally further international support for action on Xinjiang? And does he agree with me that China can only be considered a leading member of the international community if it abides by basic human rights norms?
Well, can I thank him for his support, thank my honourable friend for his support. It is crucially important, although we've got 30 countries making the stance today, that we swell those numbers. Different regions around the world, different countries take a different view, but I think it is absolutely crucial that we swell the ranks and also hold up China to keeping its obligations. This is in part about human rights, and it's in part about a leading member of the international community being held to account for living up to its international obligations.
Let's head to Paul Blomfield. Paul.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Foreign Secretary has described what's happening to the Uyghur Muslims as barbarianism we had hoped lost to another era. He's previously set out some measures on the use of forced labour from Xinjiang province in supply chains. So will he now commit to strengthening Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act